So welcome everybody. My name is Elisa Iturbe and I'm a faculty member here at the Cooper Union where we're hosting this event today. I'm here to introduce the event, our guests, and then to moderate the discussion afterwards. And so we're here to discuss the book, The Natures of Enclosures, which is edited by Jeffrey Nesbit. And this is the event, this event is the launch of this wonderful book. I'm going to let Jeffrey give the introduction to that book. So I'm just going to launch into introducing all of our guests today. So Jeffrey Nesbit is an architect, an urbanist, and an educator. He recently received his Doctor of Design degree from Harvard University Graduate School of Design. He's the H. Gene Pierce Endowed Chair at Texas Tech University. And his work focuses on infrastructural urbanization and the rise of what he calls technical lands. Currently, his research examines the 20th century American spaceport complex at the intersection of architecture, infrastructure, and aerospace history. And he's written several journal articles and chapters on the topics of infrastructure, environment, and urbanization. And he's the editor of the book that we're here to discuss today. Daisy Ames is the founding principal of Studio Ames, an architectural design and research office based in New York City. The work of the studio focuses on the intersection of art and architecture and investigates how perception can inform new visual and physical experiences. Daisy's research focuses on the spatial implications of social, economic, and political shifts within cities and how these intersecting forces affect contemporary models of living. Her drawings and her writings have been featured in exhibitions and publications, including the Venice Architecture Biennale, Storefront for Art and Architecture, Sir John Soane's Museum, Log, and a bunch of other places. She has previously taught studios and seminars at Rice, at Yale, at Pratt. She also currently teaches at Columbia University Graduate School of Architecture, Planning and Preservation, and there she was the coordinator of the GSAP Housing Lab for 2019 to 2020. And Daisy received her Bachelor of Arts in Anthropology and History of Art and Architecture from Brown University, and she received a Master of Architecture from Yale School of Architecture. Lydia Kalipoliti is an architect, engineer, and scholar. She holds a diploma in architecture and engineering from the Aristotle University of Thessaloniki. I hope I said that somewhat correctly. And an SMRS in design and building technology from MIT, as well as a Master of Arts and a PhD from Princeton University. Prior to Cooper Union, Lydia was an assistant professor at RPI, where she was director of the MS Art program. She also was assistant professor at Syracuse University and assistant professor adjunct at Columbia University, and the Cooper Union, where she served as a senior associate at the Institute for Sustainable Design, and she was also the Feltman Chair in Lighting. Her research focuses on the intersections of architecture, technology, and environmental politics, and more particularly on recycling material experiments, theories of waste and reuse, as well as closed and self-reliant systems and urban environments. Mae-ling Loco is an architectural scientist, designer, and educator from Ghana and the Philippines. Her work centers on the upcycling of agri-waste and biopolymer materials. Mae-ling holds a PhD and Masters of Science in Architectural Science from the Center for Architecture, Science, and Ecology at RPI. She also holds a BA from Tufts University. Her research integrates a broad range of technical, environmental, social, and cultural criteria that questions contemporary material value systems. Mae-ling co-develops also business models for upcycling between the global north and south, and evolves material design criteria to meet generative justice goals. Mae-ling was the director of the Building Sciences program and assistant professor at RPI School of Architecture from 2018 to 2021. She teaches studios and seminars on energy and ecology in relation to the built environment, upcycling, and material life cycle design, both at RPI School of Architecture and at the Center for Architecture, Science, and Ecology in Industry City. So as you can see, we have an amazing group of people here with us today. And so with that, I'm going to hand it over to Jeffrey, who will introduce us to the book that we are going to be discussing. So thank you all for being here. Looking forward to discussing with you.
Thank you, Elisa, and thank you to the Cooper Union for the invitation to have this discussion with some incredible colleagues, and thanks to the panel. As Elisa suggested, I'm going to be covering the book and its content. So I'll try to keep this short because we also want to hear from the other panelists as well. Throughout history, territory has been occupied and inherently entangled with the various modes of power and colonization. As empires fabricated walls and stretched their power forcefully outside their own boundaries in order to exert control, territory has been manipulated over and over again. And it is argued in this project that such processes of territorial occupation describe planetary scales of enclosing nature, both politically and economically. From Joseph Paxton's Crystal Palace to Buckminster Fuller's Spaceship Earth, nature became enclosed. Fuller's geodesic domes became symbols of American counterculture. Yet, in his description of Spaceship Earth, the environment inside the dome seemed to have priority over everything residing on the outside, a world of civilized control on its interior and wilderness, war, and wasteland on the other side. Particularly in the post-war era, humanity became obsessed with generating a fully closed and synthetically constructed world in a machine. As we identify contemporary challenges faced in a post-COVID world, perhaps problems within the design praxis and ideological incompetence are failing to produce innovative environmental strategies or to raise questions regarding air, atmosphere, in the capital of the vertically enclosed. For instances of climate-controlled air systems in single-family residences, to an increase of international investments in the construction of pencil towers made available through air rights, the built environment encompasses and encloses volumes of space for the sake of capital and political control. In 2020, I was approached by Urban Next and asked to run a podcast of kind of a mini series to launch their new podcast program, and had asked if I had any content to share. And the topic of nature of enclosure actually spins off of one of my chapters in my dissertation. But really, the source of the material is coming from a range of colleagues from diverse backgrounds and experiences and expertise. So much of this project relies really on them, really less on me.
Welcome to Urban Next Exchanges, a podcast by urbannext.net, the digital platform that aims to expand architecture to rethink cities. You are listening to an episode from Nature of Enclosure, a series hosted by Jeffrey S. Nesbit, exploring the status of enclosure in the design fields and its impact on contemporary forms of capital, culture, and politics.
So the content really began with a series of conversations with all of these wonderful colleagues. After the mini-series had concluded, it became clear that we wanted to make it into a printed book material. So it ended up becoming a book with Actar. So I'm thankful for both Urban Next and Actar publishers. For the purpose of this book, the architecture as object or infrastructure as utility are not of primary concern. Instead, we consider the relationship between economics and forms of power to include cultural imagination and the role of architecture in creating closed forms of capital as a condition of infrastructure. As Hannah Arendt tells us, it is in the nature of being to appear and thus disclose itself. It is in the nature of process to remain invisible. And thus, the objects of enclosures as such appear to be incubators for something else entirely. Organized in three parts: nature of the synthetic environment, air, capital, and the planetary imaginary, and enclosed boundaries of political geographies, this book continues the conversation with a collection of essays reflecting on the provocative discussions and expanding on the discourse of enclosed environments in our related and allied design fields. With a short foreword by Antoine Picon to kick off the book, the beginning part one, nature of the synthetic environment. In this first section, the essays establish primary definitions and historical episodes that describe nature as a synthetic construction of enclosed space, environment, and technology. The section opens with Lydia Calipoletti's chapter, Bubble Problems, an Archaeology of Infection and Environmental Control, which outlines the historical and contemporary society, culture, and structure of closed worlds. From the sterilization methods and space-related activities in NASA's laboratories to the rise of environmental consciousness, Calipoletti provides a framework for useful questions of outside and inside hysteria. To focus the commentary on synthetic natures, in his chapter, Subjects of Enclosure, Pre-NASA Astronauts in the USAF Space Cabin Simulator, Jordan Bim recalls the first flight simulations from the United States Air Force as an early derivative of enclosing subjects for surveillance, automation, and analysis of the artificially enclosed environment. Adjacent to sealed simulations of space cabin simulators, intentionally, we place the following chapter in Praise of the Open by Alexandra Jeske to explore a different type of synthetic nature through the interior ecology of the greenhouse. She poetically describes the deeper relationships between loneliness, enclosure, and the banyan under glass, as she refers to it, a kind of garden in the machine. It was the traditional European garden, an exterior curation of natural vegetation that was used to demonstrate wealth, intelligence, and power. However, by the 20th century, the former notion of garden was transformed into a technologically occupied space. Borrowing directly from the discussions with Bim and Jeske, The Storm Before the Calm by Fred Sharman reminds us that the environmental enclosures are in fact failures to protect the fragile environments on the interior and thus distance and alienate extraplanetary environments. Moving from the massive cosmos back toward questions of computation and biological systems, in her chapter, Computing Unbounded, De-anthropocizing Knowledge in Living Systems, Rachel Armstrong describes the more than human realm of our biological world. For Armstrong, the importance of computational systems contributes to the evolutionary diversity of future ecologies. To conclude the first section on synthetic natures, David Solomon's chapter, aptly entitled On the Comfort of Cows and Computers, cleverly theorizes in the obsolescence of the autonomous enclosed object and advocates for an architecture of the non-human beyond the individualized icons to rethinking the future infrastructural landscape. Part 2, Air, Capital, and the Planetary Imaginary, expands on the role of air in politics in shaping new architecturally kinetic environments from interior air to the vertically occupied. This section describes air as a form of design knowledge, rendering the planetary atmosphere as a legible and controlled economic state, and challenges future ways of living on the ground and in the air. As an entry into the colonization of air, Mae-ling Locos shows how the reproduction of air in the greenhouse and the rejection of air in buildings are forms of the colonial project and equally contribute to the failures of sensible climate strategies around the world. The next chapter by Daniel Barber focuses on the air as a politics of opening. Barber claims the invention and ubiquitous use of air conditioning systems around the world, along with the high-rise towers of capital and sprawling urban footprints, gave rise to an unhealthy and accelerated challenge in global climate management. In Redistributing Sensible Atmospheres, Kathy Velikoff and Jeffrey Thun then demonstrate through various and quite extreme differences of scales alternative approaches to making air a legible and active medium in the design process, thus rendering the limits of enclosure, environment, and air itself. As we move into the more enclosed housing forms of enclosures, we begin to continue to explore the role of design and architecture of air through Daisy Ames' chapter on integrating housing knowledge. She claims that the policies and legal structures keep us enclosed and argues that the challenges of rendering the air legible include forms of knowledge found within our disciplinary history, and outdated practices of representation. We'll hear more from all three in a moment. The following chapter by Gallo Canizares, Astropolis, Aquapolis, and Aeropolis, Capital's Enclosure, focuses less on the enclosure of air and instead radically speculates on the architectural enclosures and occupations in the air. Canizares offers a link between works of science fiction, such as those by Stanley Kubrick, histories of utopian down in the sea, up in the air, and out to the stars. This section concludes with preliminary notes on the late capitalist skyscraper as a morphology of enclosure by Mariano Gomez Luque, theorizing the very tall building from the 20th century as a vehicle for global trade, economy, and capital accumulation. For Gomez Luque, the environmental crises can be traced by the morphologies of enclosures, including late capitalism's ability to racialize and exploit the semi-privatization of public space on the ground and in the sky. Part 3, Enclosed Boundaries of Political Geographies. This section moves outward horizontally across the planet to critically illustrate how public space, land, and vast territories reveal deep cultural and political forms for how geographic space has become hostile, militarized, and controlled. Beginning with Through the Looking Glass, Sean Rickenbacker argues that the enclosure of buildings bounding public space contributes to the contemporary challenges of American society and American politics. For Rickenbacker, the facade, including screens, advertisements, and the commercial aesthetic, become a symbol of corporate messaging to signal and stratify the public realm associated with surveillance, land ownership, and ultimately a form of public control. Ursula Krippa and Stephen Mueller follow up with False Fronts, an excerpt offering evidence for how military operations use the city as a template of enclosures meant to exploit architecture and exploit urban design practices and military training sites in the remote landscapes. Continuing with the military perspective, Joël Vacheron, chapter Strategic Defense Initiative, High Stakes in Outer Space, illustrates how critical graphics impacted the imagination, observation, and technological instrumentation for defense and planetary communications. But perhaps moving more specifically into questions of land of enclosure, Julius Machelow's chapter, Ecological Accounting and the Spatial Dynamics of Incentivized Conservation, uses forest harvesting practices in Southern Ontario to better understand financial investments, invisible labor practices, management life cycles, and ecological impacts shaping broader practices of land governance. Josh Nasons extends the conversation of conservation practices and tries to tie the rise of enclosure of a wilderness as a form of nation building in his chapter Rebound, Dialogues Around National Parks. And lastly, the book concludes with a deeply personal reflection from Mishuana Guomen in her chapter, Flooding Settler Enclosures, Asserting Indigenous Presence. Guomen reflects on how the relationship between geography, land, mapping, and language contributes to narration and sovereignty. And thus, racialized spaces and nation-state practices portrayed by Guomen destroy the presence of indigeneity, aesthetics, and the embodied sovereignty of land, water, air, and life.
I am been recently traveling throughout my home territories. I'm Tonawanda Band of Seneca, and I traveled from there to Maine. So this kind of discussion about what is the nature of enclosure for me also includes questions about what does presence mean to me? What does it mean to be present in one's own territory? That kind of defies a nature of enclosure that's been implemented through colonial structures. So I was traveling to...
Such processes reveal political and geographic boundaries, showing how environments are marked, militarized, and eventually made inaccessible, invisible, and enclosed. processes of urbanization are increasingly extending into a wide variety of geographic conditions across the globe. Regardless of its defined parameters, the definitions of enclosed forms of capital have been critically redefined to loosen the framework of such specificity of land, air, and bounded rationality. Thank you for listening. I believe we will now hand it over to Lydia, if that sounds good.
Thank you so much, Jeffrey. I'm really happy to be part of this amazing group of people, and in alliance with my colleagues Daisy and Mae-ling, which I truly appreciate in their work. So I'm going to share my screen and start my hopefully very short presentation. Can you all see it? Yeah, okay, people are nodding. So the chapter that I wrote for this book is called Bubble Problems, and it mainly focuses on two historical examples, one being the BIOS 3, which was a living experiment in Siberia for closed regenerative life system. And the second was the phytotron experiments of a plant physiologist called Fritz Wendt. That was in the 50s, and BIOS was in the 60s and 70s. But both of these examples are shared in my previous book, which was called The Architecture of Closed Worlds. But today I'm going to focus on some thoughts on the bubble that are a little bit more general, reflecting the nature of the pandemic and the way that it has forced us to understand and analyze how processes of sterilization and the avoidance of infection have migrated from a living laboratory to the way that we construct build environments within urban reality. So during the clickbait of the COVID-19 crisis, these famous icons of bubbles and decontamination protocols have resurged with no return. House record codes, balloons, masks, and mind expanders, Coop Himmelblau's restless spheres in Basel, and Buckminster Fuller's and Soja Sadow's dome over Manhattan have all become ultimate icons of prophylactic spaces, organizations of containment and engineered safety. Bubbles are both emblems of climatic control and of the hygienic conception of a pure, disinfected atmosphere, one that is regimented and safeguarded for selected subjects. It is extraordinarily exclusive and politically biased. During the mid-19th century, the goal of improving public health combined with a better understanding of air's thermodynamic properties impelled a persistent interest in building ventilation, which is something that we have seen resurge incredibly powerfully during the pandemic. At the time, it was generally accepted that human exhalations contained deadly poisons. These were called foul or vitiated air, which were issued from one's lungs and were considered the main cause of human illness, responsible, according to many reports, for 40% of all deaths. In a striking alignment to today's analysis of coronavirus intertransmission and super spreading events, heating and ventilation engineer and self-proclaimed health expert Louis Leeds argued in his book, A Treatise on Ventilation, that men's breath was his own worst enemy. Despite the need for ventilation and all of the arguments of 19th century public health crisis, Reyner Banham's famous idiosyncratic fascination with the sealed bubble, which we all know, and it was definitely at once a critique, a satire, and an effort to dismantle probably the object of enclosure, found refuge in the American ideal of comfort, the authority to control and regulate in an act of, we can say, ultimate hubris, one's atmospheric contents via mechanical ventilation systems. What remains a paradox is the fact that Banham's environmental control has surfaced as a sustainable design paradigm in controlling the atmosphere, something that really saves energy. With blockage from the mechanics of the exterior world and any adversity that such encounters with the outside might entail, buildings have saved significant amounts of energy. And it is because of their numerical performance that they're esteemed as environmentally favorable, reducing thermal loss. In light of this controversial conservationist ethic, the protective uterine environment of the bubble has been consistently translated as a conserved ecological milieu, blocked and safeguarded from the effluence of the exterior world. Transmission studies show how with every action that we take, like breathing, talking, sneezing, our bodily byproducts offset entire microecologies that reach every surface of the spaces we occupy. Our encounter with with a cloud of dust or the foul air of a passing body might lead, in fact, to illness, but not all building microecologies are harmful. After all, we ourselves are microbial entities, constellations of bacteria, viruses, and other microorganisms. We are receptors of non-human elements and composed of cells that are mostly non-human. In this light, the defensive separation of inside, outside, of shielding ourselves in bubbles cannot act as the exclusive protective measure against disease. Interior plant-based phytoremediation, microbial mats used for water filtration, and other microbe-activated filtration media may enable us to coexist with other organisms and develop multi-scale and multi-species spaces of interaction. The bubble, the ultimate protective medium against pathogens and illness, cannot save us. It is only an illusion of control that engenders a psychosocial interiority that sets its contents apart from the outside world. A dirtier, more fuzzy reality of multi-species constituents might lead us to a new normality. In conjecturing how the pandemic would reshape architecture, journalist Kyle Chaika wrote in The New Yorker in the summer of 2020 that in the midst of social distancing, the spaces of confinement need not be clean, sanitized, white, and smooth. In their place, he suggested a textured hideaway, like an animal's den, full of reminders that the rest of the world still exists in all its faults, blemishes, and variations. So far, the role of building technology to insulate spaces from environmental flows has been suggestive of a moral discipline that protected buildings against disease, transferring an ideological framework of Protestant theology and ethics to the microrealm of materials. Nevertheless, in a new reality of interrelated crises, namely the public health crisis, climate change, and environmental inequity, a new role may be cast to the notion of environment. Instead of it being the inactive, static, and historicized context within which an architectural object is placed, the environment can quite literally become the object of design itself. Thank you so much.
I believe I go next, right, Jeffrey?
That's fine.
Okay. I'd like to begin by thanking again, Jeffrey, for your invitation to contribute to the nature of enclosure. I too am super excited to be a part of this group, and I'm grateful for you seeing this this productive overlap of my work and with this theme, you know, in advance as we've discussed. Make sure my slides are advancing. They're advancing for everybody, right? Thumbs up. Okay, cool. So, you know, being included with these esteemed thinkers, you know, Mae-ling and Daniel Barber previously on the podcast, now Lydia, it's allowing me to kind of think about adjacent themes and topics that I would not have been able to otherwise. So I'm excited. A little bit of context about about my contribution. Again, my name is Daisy Ames. I'm the principal of Studio Ames, and my design and research studio is based in New York City. I'm a visiting professor here at Cooper Union and a critic at Yale School of Architecture, where I teach analysis and housing design. So I come to this idea of nature of enclosure in terms of analyzing past, present, and future housing design and housing policy. The way in which I address this in my essay, Integrating Housing Knowledge, is through a series of representations that deploy techniques that rely on the fine-tuned relationship between the precise vector or the amorphous raster, the pixelized, so combining those two techniques to create and communicate about elements that are not immediately apparent or purposely hidden out of view. So the term that I use is invisibilized. So within the practice of architecture, we've been trained in depicting acoustic, thermal, water barriers as ways of communicating to structural engineers, electricians, consultants. And so through this highly specific language of fills, dashes, line weights, line types, professionals in the building trades can immediately recognize, for example, the difference between a dashed door swing in plan and a dashed line indicating something overhead. So these rules of abstracting the built environment are quite extensive, though there's no kind of like collectively sanctioned convention that helps us communicate things about our built environment that we cannot see. So how do we visualize our enclosure within a particular history? How do we visualize a particular sense of risk? And so how does space make us feel? How do we make visible these elements that are intuited at some deep level, but have not yet fully cohered as thoughts in our conscious minds? So these are the questions that I'm curious about speculating on and potentially answering through representation. The elements that I've become most kind of curious about are these invisibilized aspects of architectural production. And the ones that I'm focused on are air, waste, energy, material sourcing, water, and labor. To unpack some of the conventions of the practice of architecture a bit further, for example, it's status quo to snake electrical lines between studs of a wall. It's status quo to embed plumbing branch lines underneath the concrete floor slab to house water tanks and kind of antiquated structures on roofs, and allocate mechanical rooms to the basement, as I think Daniel Barber mentioned in the Meyerson Hall at UPenn, that kind of all the guts of the building are being housed in the basement. So this creates a distance about how these elements are relative to the interior living spaces, the spaces that we occupy. This distance, and again, like abstraction of how these elements contribute to our sense of comfort, safety, and health within a living space is worth a closer look. So this distance has produced, what I call a kind of knowledge gap between the unchallenged methods of production and our ability to collectively see, to collectively share, to collectively know about elements that are being invisibilized. So the kind of not knowing and the has allowed individuals to, as they say, keep calm and carry on. And maybe this is where I overlap with, Mae-ling in her essay, where she speaks about human climactic tolerances as these kind of deep-seated cultural and social constructs of comfort. Or even, again, Daniel Barber's provocations in his essay, After Comfort, where he says, perhaps architects, new ambition should be to condition humans to be uncomfortable. So I find these sentiments, what these sentiments share is a willingness to challenge how we have defaulted or consumed a way of knowing, consumed or absorbed a way of being, accepted levels of not knowing, and how we live today. They also offer us a glimpse into a way of being that asks us, how willing are we to be uncomfortable? If we live in a modern, technologically advanced age, with seemingly endless amounts of diverse knowledge at our fingertips, how do we use it? So I argue that these established conventions and norms and the practice of invisibilizing elements are the backbone of our profession. They are also the backbone of our socio-political dynamics that have and continue to structure life in the United States. So for me, these are linked and contribute to establishing a kind of artificial foundation for the way things are. They're linked, for example, when we acknowledge the socio-political forces that act on the one hand to provide safe enclosures to certain groups of people, but on the other hand, act to enclose groups of people who share a particular risk. So we've seen this play out numerous times throughout history, like in Flint, Michigan, clean water crisis, the wildfires in the West that burned through decades of environmental and developmental policies, the extreme flooding in the Southeast, energy crisis in Texas, and of course, the recent failure to maintain adequate indoor temperature in the Twin Parks in the Bronx. So these kinds of enclosures, masked as they are as quote, natural disasters, are deeply tied to housing policy, which determine who has access to safe, comfortable, healthy housing, living spaces. So what role can architects' skills play in bringing these events into focus? In the work of my office, with today's vast collection of environmental sensors, robust databases, it's possible to create a fine-grained portrait of an area's air quality, for example. So there's real-time data available to us through the United States Environmental Protection Agency Air Quality Index. And this can be cross-referenced with global and local articles about air quality, publicly accessed community board meeting minutes, and changes to state laws to gain an understanding about the interaction between air quality and government policies. So working with the data available through the University of Richmond's Mapping Inequality, redlining the New Deal America project, my office works to bridge these relationships between air quality and formerly redlined areas. One of these maps is Birmingham, Alabama, that I address in the essay. And this is a state that was first home to first the Cherokees, the Choctaws, the Creeks, and the Chickasaws. And it's a city in Alabama, along with Mobile and Montgomery, that have been redlined. The city occupies the Jones Valley. It's a low area flanked by parallel mountain ranges along the north and south sides of the city limits, outlined in red here at a kind of zoomed out scale. The city is surrounded by natural deposits of iron ore, coal, limestone, allowing it to be a really thriving industrial steel industry, resulting in the kind of one of the lowest raw material and assembly costs in the nation at the end of the 19th century. And in addition to the proximity, and we're zooming in a little bit here to the kind of meat of where I'm interested in exploring Birmingham a bit further, the proximity of these raw material deposits and the growth of the city in tandem with the steel industry was spurred by a large labor movement that consisted of recently freed slaves and poor whites in search of steady work outside of the agricultural sector. And so racial attitudes in favor of segregation and traditional social structures led to 64% of the city being redlined as a result of the Homeowners Loan Corporation's HOLC maps. These areas were typically amongst the most low-lying within the city and adjacent to urban and manufacturing cores that were deemed dangerous and undesirable at the time, quote unquote dangerous. The consequences of redlining in the Hulk maps led to Birmingham being one of the most segregated cities in America. So today, 70% of Birmingham's population identifies as Black or African American, and non-white populations largely reside in neighborhoods along the center and lowest points of the Jones Valley. So what do we do with these past maps, and how do they relate to today? Our research, we've discovered that there is such a thing as this Title V major source operating permit. And this is a current permit, which is being issued by the Jefferson County Board of Health. And these permits allow for businesses to engage in practices that have the potential to emit 10 tons per year or more of any one hazardous air pollutant, 25 tons per year or more of any combination of hazardous air pollutants, or 100 tons per year or more of any regulated air pollutant within the same red line area. So further lowering property values and causing health risks. So if we compare this air toxicity map with that of the whole red line regions, we can see a pretty clear correlation. And what our research shows is that individuals living in these formerly red line communities, as I mentioned, were low lying, subject to flooding, low lying, subject to not having access to fresh air. And on top of that, on top of these conditions, there are contemporary policies that further do harm to the air quality in these areas. Due to predatory zoning, the vast majority of the businesses within Birmingham holding these licenses licenses to pollute exist within these former redlined communities and raising health concerns. So Jeffrey, you asked this question in your introduction: how can design learn from ecological sciences, encourage social equity, and address climate change to provide better alternatives? Design is certainly one of them, but first, I believe that seeing and knowing the problem is another. With this kind of diverse set of skills, architects are uniquely positioned to produce representations and to make visible the diverse array of factors that impact our built environment. The drawings included in my contribution to the book combine information that cuts across boundaries, geographic layers, various time scales, and historical narratives. So these layered representations in many ways go against the classifying ethos of Enlightenment, rather separating the world into kind of distinct categories. Studio Ames's drawings are instead a kind of bricolage of sensations, bricolage of information from diverse knowledge sources. So initially, these overlap might create an unease, since the kind of experiential considerations like air quality seem to have little to do with the kind of hard and abstract lines of the law. But the work of these drawings is the work of integration. I'd just like to conclude with a quote from Isabel Wilkerson from CAST. Just as the studs and joists and beams that form the infrastructure of a building are not visible to those who live in it, so it is with CAST. Its very invisibility is what gives it power and longevity. And though it may move in and out of consciousness, though it may flare and reassert itself in times of upheaval and recede in times of relative calm, it is an ever-present through line in our country's operation. Thank you.
Thank you, Daisy, and thank you, Lydia, for both those presentations, which strike many chords around the relationship of air and enclosure at different scales, and are incredibly inspiring and thought-provoking. And to Jeffrey for the kind invitation to contribute to the Nature of Enclosure podcast and this book, which for me was an opportunity to think about the colonization project in terms of agriculture and architecture, but through air. So of the three primary media that compose the earth, land, water, and air, the most extroverted and reactionary is air. Often when we think about colonization in relationship to anything, it is of the land, of a settler community inhabiting a pretty defined territory, and much less about air. In this essay in particular, I chose to focus on tropical air, which on a global scale would be defined as air masses that form around the equatorial belt of our planet that typically has high energy due to the fact that the water and land in these areas receive twice the amount of sun as compared to other places around the world. So this is a tropically rich air zone originating around the equator, and that is characterized by high temperature and humidity. And there are a series of figures in the paper that are visualized through the 20th century psychrometric chart that we often use in architecture to teach human thermal comfort and how we can control air. Instead, these series of figures are not so much about the control of air, but rather how we visualize ourselves, flora, and other species as tempered by and controlled by the conditions of air. The essay sort of focuses on two enclosure concepts around the control of air: the reproduction of tropical air within the greenhouse enclosure beginning in the 19th century, and the rejection of tropical air as part of the indoor human thermal comfort project in the 20th century. Inasmuch as tropical soils and land give rise to lush tropical forests and high levels of species richness, tropical air plays an even more decisive acute role. While land or water may take time to mediate heat, energy, or changes in chemical composition to affect the microbes and flora or humans that live in or in contact with it, air has an even more powerful reactionary and omnipresent relationship. A change in the heat of air can kill a plant in a number of hours. Its control within specific temperature ranges can hold off or trigger fruiting. And the same can be said for what it does to affect the function of our human core organs. The reproduction of tropical air begins with the history of the botanical garden. Developed initially on the estates of wealthy aristocrats in the 18th, 19th century in Europe and Great Britain, these spaces were large-scale repositories for showcasing tropical exotic specimens. Within what was known as the Botanical Garden Network, the greenhouse enclosure facilitated the capture and breeding of tropical flora divorced from their native habitats and reproduction of tropical air. Under King George III, over 10,000 plant species acquired from voyages and conquests were housed in royal gardens at Kew. And by the mid-19th century, what began as a royal hobby collection became a robust technology for colonization of new territories. In the greenhouse, relative to soil and water, greenhouse air in particular began to be viewed as an abundantly available resource, one that was sucked into the interior, heat dumped into it, circulated impatiently, and expelled in regulated quantities. It became the first line for modifying the temperature of interior air. As the botanic scientific research enterprise matured, tropical air conditioning, even within the greenhouse at Kew, led to breeding and dispersal of tropical seeds across an even wider range of regions, including the subtropics, the arid and semi-arid climates. So in this sense, control around the energy-intensive reproduction of tropical air in temperate zone greenhouses enabled the calibration and scale-up of land colonization far beyond the tropical zone. In the diverse climatic context of colonial India, for example, not only were Indian gardeners professionally trained at Kew, but in some cases, the greenhouse enclosure and stove technologies were exported to India. Prior to establishing plantation land, greenhouses in the colonies were instrumental in the localized experimentation and scale-up of hybrid seed bombs within the wider empire's botanical network, including the oil palm from Ghana, the kola nut, cinchona, and rubber from South America. And as the economic profits from the trade of plantation economy soared, transformation in the professional networks and social structures in the colonies became consolidated in the Botanical Science Institution and its worldview. In the mid-19th century, with the expansion of public access and the use of the botanical greenhouse expanded beyond its function as a scientific institution, it also began to serve as a prototype for continuous human occupancy indoors. while the social function of the greenhouses on the estates of the wealthy had been normalized through the tradition of touring and showcasing private botanical gardens, human occupancy had relatively been temporary, low, and outside the purview of air conditioning goals. Joseph Paxton's design and construction of the Crystal Palace for the Great Exhibition in the 1850s meant the first time that an 18,000 square foot hall was enclosed and conditioned by these new greenhouse technologies. The presence of 80,000 people within the Crystal Palace at any one time shifted the conditioning of 33 million cubic feet of air within the glass enclosure from heating for plant cultivation and survival to ventilation cooling for large-scale human occupancy. Thus, the co-constitution of plants and humans within the greenhouse became a powerful engine for socializing the importation of imperial culture and its taste for commodities, including seeds, land, manufactured goods, and now air. As the British Empire began to expand, the technological innovation that we saw in air conditioning was spurred on not in the botanical sciences, but by distributed advances in the industrial sciences. Originating in the American paper printing industry, psychrometrics began to give an even greater degree of control over the content of heat and moisture in air. Unlike the greenhouse enclosures focus on cooling space for human occupation, industrial air conditioning became a customized maintenance of precise levels of temperature, humidity, and air quality. While earlier conditioned spaces were mostly centralized and found in public spaces, the successful commodification of the single unit room scale air conditioner began to take what seemed to be a public luxury into the domestic sphere. Once adopted, the reliance on air-conditioned environments was so swift that it was described as an addictive epidemic. In newly independent nation states, particularly in cooling-dominated tropical, subtropical, and arid climates, the uptake of air conditioning became integral to the nation-state development project. In tropical, hot, humid climates, cool indoors lengthened the workday beyond the cool early morning and the dusk period. And so I end by reflecting on examining our relationship with air in the midst of this history, thinking about how our treatment of air in the act of enclosing, how we value it and use it to different ends, what that ultimately does to us. Very much inspired by Dan Barber's After Comfort paper that we read as part of the podcast, I end by addressing the legacy of mechanical air conditioning by returning to our bodies and our relationships with air that is primarily driven by fear and alienation. In that sense, in order to stop abusing air, we firstly need to activate a new type of confidence in how our bodies relate to the environment. Our evolutionary capacity to sweat in the presence of tropical air to feel alive. And this is very much an invitation for us to create a new liberatory activist framework that engages both our mind and body. And I think I'll end there.
Thank you to all of you. Really fantastic. So I want to start the discussion simply by saying that I love the premise of the book. And I think that we're going to be very hard pressed to address the issues facing us today if we don't take a critical stance on the notion of enclosure. So, just to start, thank you, Jeffrey, for convening this discussion, both in book form and podcast form and in the discussion today. So my questions are a bit zoomed out, in part because I'm interested in the framework itself. So I should mention that my questions really are for everyone. And my hope or my goal is to touch on the underlying themes that I think connect all of your work. So just to get started, so in his foreword to the book, Antoine Picon ends his foreword by talking about how the Anthropocene has made us more cognizant of porosity, right, and its corollary boundaries, right? And so he talks about the boundaries between the human and non-human, flows of heat, flows of light, and how these flows are both naturally occurring and constructed. In an Anthropocene, we become more aware of them. So as I was reading this, I started to think, is there perhaps a productive difference for us to think about in terms of boundaries versus enclosures? Like, is there a difference between them? Is there a relation between them? And I'm thinking here about how, for example, in ecosystems, boundaries are extremely rich areas of exchange, right? So in the boundary between two ecosystems, we tend to find the most nutrients, high levels of energy exchange, faster rates of ecological succession, et cetera. But in architecture, our practices of enclosure, that especially those that develop during modernity, are basically the opposite. Or we're trying to prevent exchange. And or in the case of political territories, which also gets covered in the notion of enclosures in the book, we delimit space in order to clearly draw the edges of a political jurisdiction, right? So the precision of that boundary becomes enormously important to the state. And that's something very visceral to me because I grew up on the US-Mexico border. But by asking if there's a difference between boundary and enclosure, I guess I'm not trying to just ask a question about semantics, but to ask really, are there differences there, and what are the terms and concepts that can really help us to think about edges differently? And that's for everybody.
I'll just jump off very briefly and hand it over to my colleagues. The first, perhaps the best way I can identify with your question in this project particularly has to do with the scale of the view. So boundaries exist at one scale, while enclosures exist at a much broader view. So, thinking about either Daisy's work on invisibility or Mae-ling's work on the distribution of a kind of air enclosure around the world, on one hand, we could say that there are political boundaries that are jurisdictions of certain kinds of, in Daisy's red lines, whatnot. But that perhaps is simply a small piece of a much broader, larger territory that's being occupied through certain kinds of policies and regulations around the world. So that's how I'll start, but I'll hand it over to my colleagues.
Well, I can offer that maybe the through line with all of our contributions has to do with the amorphous factor that air and comfort are things that there are no conventions for drawing, and so we have to look elsewhere to understand their boundaries and their enclosures. And I think that in the case of redlining, it operated for the federal survey as a boundary, but it worked as an enclosure. It worked to essentially keep people from being able to get mortgages for the homes that they did live in. And so in that way, the policy worked as both a boundary and an enclosure. And what's happened is the air moves in and out and can stay in these low-lying areas based on geographic location. And what I found in my research is that policy and the geographical location, whether it's at the top of a mountain range or the bottom of a valley, you start to see a correlation between policy and essentially the topography of the earth. But the air is the thing that is hard to measure. And I think we're only starting to find a way to represent those things and bring them into a kind of productive, qualitative conversation balanced by a quantitative, metric that that we're able to source today.
Yeah, I think it sounds like part of the difference between a boundary and an enclosure is also just a notion of control. And I like how you described that, Daisy, because it seems to suggest that, that moment where it becomes really an enclosure is that moment where there's that sort of element of power. And I think what you describe in redlining is also the inability of people or other living beings to basically leave that zone that has been designated. to be allowed to be toxic, right? And so there's a notion of control there that I think is really interesting. So, I mean, I wonder, Jeffrey, you opened your presentation by talking about the relationship between economics and power and cultural imagination, right? You gave us that kind of triad. And so, of course, you expressed concern for architecture creating these closed forms of capital. So at the heart of that question, you know, it's not just what kind of architecture should we make, but also what do we make architecture for, or who might we make architecture for? Or, you know, what are the ends for which architecture is made, essentially? And I see that as a question that's underlying all of your presentations in your focus on the relationship between architecture and enclosure and these spaces of control. So there's this idea of like, what are the ends for which architecture is made? So I guess I'm wondering, how do we wrap our heads around the social and economic and the material conditions that give rise to architecture? And perhaps more importantly, how do we change those ends for which architecture is produced? Do we have, as architects, the means to do so?
Thanks, Elisa, for that. I think that question resonates a lot with the impact of air conditioning, particularly in the global South. And, you know, when I talked about the colonization of air, you know, it's incredible to think about how the architecture that we create today has been very much influenced by that legacy, though it has been geographically displaced and delayed in some senses. Our relationship to this tropical air is incredibly, I guess we fight it, we try to stay away from it, we try to tame it. And there's this desire, a very strong cultural desire, social desire, to embrace, you know, this new type of great indoors, the cool, the controlled, the clean environment that is so intricately linked to class, to status and hospitality. And so we've entered the realm of cultural forces driving the type of indoors that we want, and inadvertently drives the materials in our building typologies. And so that desire is very difficult, you know, practicing as an architect where I'm from. Overcoming that requires not necessarily a punitive or restrictive approach, but an understanding of how one might be able to stretch the boundary of the enclosure so that one can temper all of the fear and alienation of tropical air as you move into the embryo of the building. And that's been sort of the way I've sort of seen it. But it's hard, you know, as I mentioned before, once you've tasted or experienced cool air, it's almost impossible to reverse that, you know, addiction. So just in the context of air, I think about that a lot and how that shapes, you know, many cities in the global South and in tropical zones.
I'll add to that. And before that, I just want to say that Mae-ling and Daisy, I loved your presentations. I think they're phenomenal. And I can't wait to get the book in my hands, Jeffrey. I think, you know, what Mae-ling just said, and I think it's very important that she resulted in the visceral kind of raw reality of the body, not in its anatomy, but of its ability to sweat, to experience certain conditions as related to surrounding environmental elements, is very important, because if you think not only of, you know, early greenhouses, but also very recent corporate projects that have become ubiquitous, Google's Interior, or Amazon's Biosphere. And I think I saw Fred Sharman somewhere in this kind of as a black box, who mentioned these examples in his book. There's a huge desire to overcome, you know, real natural context, like to create kinds of architecture that reproduce natures in a way, not to just create spaces that people will inhabit. And I think that desire is very much linked to economical concerns. It is perceived as a form of luxury capital comfort that can be purchased and bought and safeguard certain selected populations that are inside. And I think it is extremely important that we identify this kind of cultural economic desire of capital. And we try to create forms of resistance to this through our practices and through understanding, regulating porosity, maybe is one thing that you mentioned, Elisa, earlier, or kind of propose new forms of exchange of access, because it is very much about constructing a new wave of indoor spaces that can regulate weathers. And I think it's very important to identify this as a cultural problem that has been developing from the early 19th century greenhouses to corporate spaces today.
So I think in some ways you answered my next question, but I'm going to ask it anyway because maybe it can add something to it and we can keep going on this theme. But I'm just really interested in the fact that the book and all of the contributions talk about how through this process of enclosure, there basically is no longer an outside. And so there are a lot of examples, from talking about national parks as now enclosed wilderness, to Lydia, your descriptions of these architectures of containment. There are just a lot of examples that you all give where we almost don't even know how to even be outside anymore, as Mae-ling you say. So I think that, of course, that's also, as you're alluding to, Lydia, a question of power and of capitalism, because capitalism aims to commodify all aspects of life, right? So I was thinking about Foucault also as I was reading your text, where he's talking about that there's nothing left that falls outside of what he calls the economic grid, right? Like every aspect of life is commodified. So then I started thinking, though, about whether there's a tension between contesting enclosure and then some of the tendencies of neoliberal capitalism that fold everything into its logic. And I was thinking about Doug Spencer's book, The Architecture of Neoliberalism. And he gives a couple of case studies, including work like Zaha's BMW factory. And he talks about how that's a paradigmatic example of architecture reifying a neoliberal logic, precisely because it uses a kind of formal complexity to create these kinds of gradients and to sort of dissolve boundaries in the kind of just-in-time production. It's sort of mirroring the logic of neoliberal capitalism. And so the architecture starts to create these spatial organizations that align with post-Fordist managerialism, right? And so he actually cites other examples from digital design, Zeropolo and Zaha and Schumacher, and he kind of brings all of those architects into question. And he's showing that there's an interest in a kind of like liquefaction that's demanded by the nature of late capitalist production. So I guess my question is, how can architecture that looks to resist the rigidity of enclosure also resist being co-opted by that kind of language, right? And I'm also thinking not just of those architects and Doug Spencer's critique, but I'm also thinking about the work of Jesse Le Cavalier, who writes about Amazon and Walmart. And he's showing that contemporary capitalist production really demands this kind of infrastructural integration. And so, Walmart and Amazon are interested in reducing resistance, eliminating friction. And Jesse in his work shows a map of Walmart's distribution maps that deliberately ignore state lines, right? So there's this idea that it's this kind of dendritic system that wants to overcome all boundaries. So I just wanted to posit that as something for discussion, and how a project for dissolving or contesting enclosures, let's say, can also resist that kind of co-opting. And maybe it has to do with the differentiations that I think Lydia is starting to bring up, like, a kind of idea around porosity, which is different from Zaha's idea of smoothness, right? Or are there other characteristics of the spaces you're looking at that can perhaps resist the logics of capital, I wonder?
Maybe just a quick response to that excellent question. For me, I think that language is rooted in looking at how our systems in our building move away from this sort of centralized one-off functions where, when we see air coming into a building, it goes to one very specific place. That's the floodgates for conditioning, controlling it, pumping it. And then every other thing in the building is relatively inert when it comes to that, even though they are reacting to everything around energy and kinetics and all of that stuff. And so that moved from this sort of specialized, centralized approach to one that is distributed and one that recognizes all of the myriad of functions is key. I think often when we see the flattening of the enclosure to this sort of single and high embodied energy material, that's when we see, the language of capitalism, that high value commodity being celebrated. And I think there's an opportunity to distribute our buildings, respond to sun and air and all of the other conditions in very different ways all across the building. That passing of resources and performance to other collaborative systems and materials in the building is something that I think inspires me and that I consistently find in some of the vernacular architecture in the hot, humid climate. So as a language, I think that's incredibly instructive.
I'll just, a fantastic conversation. I don't want to interrupt too much, but the other thing that I'm reminded of in your question, Elisa, is Victor Gruen shopping malls and the intentions that the architect had at the conception of these kinds of architectural objects were actually meant to create a kind of walkable urban place on its interior. And yet what you end up with is the exterior is this vast kind of ocean of parking lots. And that all of a sudden, in turn, reverses the role of the architecture to become perhaps an icon or a cultural image of a commodity and capital markets. And then that gets ubiquitously repeated over and over again. And so I think there's, on one hand, there's ways in which architects assume that their intentions are being produced, and then the cultural image is something else entirely. And that's perhaps some place of tension that our practice resides. And I like Mae-ling's response very much about the flattening, because then Lydia's work comes back to us again. Like the more and more we flatten, the more and more that enclosure tends to appear as it's disappearing, and yet it's actually just producing more and more enclosures. And the other last thing I'll just add to the question, and Lydia, when we were having a conversation with Antoine Picon, I remember we were talking about where the wilderness exists. Does the wilderness exist on the exterior, or in fact is the wild on its interior? And I think it goes directly back to what Elisa was suggesting, is maybe it's not so clear where these enclosures perhaps exist in a contemporary neoliberal economy, because they've proliferated so far, so vast geographically, but also architecturally are kind of hidden in plain sight, perhaps.
I think that if we look at it in this super expanded scope, and I love, Elisa, your super dense, excellent, complicated questions that touch so many fronts. But it's a very deeply rooted problem in architectural history that overlaps the problem, the construction of utopia, the construction of worlds. I think that it really is not something new that has that became a kind of engineering fantasy of reconstructing 20th century interiors using HVAC and technology. But if you think back, like we can think of Boulay's library, or we can think of the delineation of boundaries in utopian cities, and the construction of worlds as controllable interiors. So it really becomes a kind of cultural force to understand architecture as a world-making problem, and then technology comes to reinforce that concept, which is a hubris in itself. But I think that in all of these incredibly important preservations, and our also Mae-ling's urge to look at vernacular systems and rethink building technologies. And I think it's absolutely critical to rethink building technologies the way that Mae-ling was just describing before with the outlets and the intake of air. I think that it's important to also think that we cannot avoid technology anymore. Like we can't just make vernacular systems only. We are part of technology ourselves. Our own bodies have PCBs and microplastics, and we have mutated as a species in many ways and fronts. So, there's also the kind of problem of a return to a romantic position of saying, okay, let's open the windows and have fresh air, which is extremely important, but how we do that, how we regulate porosities and create these systems of exchange is also something that that is incredibly intertwined with technological advances. And Mae-ling, I do want to ask your your view on that, because it's an honest question that I've been thinking a lot when presenting the Closed Worlds book, and people ask, so what is the solution? Do we just open the windows? And I think it's not as simple as that. And I know that you have a lot to say about that. But I did want to ask your view, because I think vernacular systems are incredibly important and meaningful in regulating that kind of porosity and exchange with outdoor effluents. But how we do that might be a different kind of practice altogether.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a risk of what I said as a nostalgic or romanticizing the past way we used to build. And I don't necessarily mean that at all. I think that there is a certain group of principles that, because they were so effective, they withstood millennia. But our environment, the great indoors has changed, great outdoors has changed so much. But that responsiveness to what was around them was key, whether it was through materials, whether it was through climate, whether it was through social and human, organization in the building. And I think we can get more creative when we thicken, that building boundary to respond to the conditions that we have today. That's sort of a high level answer, but I'm incredibly inspired by, thinking about the microclimates that we see, many layers of it in our city, whether it's on the urban sidewalk or the attic space in some of our buildings. There are all these undervalued or underutilized spaces that, should we, leverage them in the capture, transformation, and circulation of air and other types of resources, we might just be able to live in a healthy way. And so that agency of material and systems, I think, needs to be blown open. And I think that appreciation has come a lot of out of my work in agricultural waste. Everything that a crop was grown to basically withstand shows up in the building material down the line. And so being able to recognize something in all its glory for what it can do, instead of optimizing just one part of it, is sort of what gives me a lot of inspiration in terms of a material and systemic approach. But yes, I fully agree. There's a lot to be done in technology, but more than that, I think our cultural and social behaviors are also going to need a lot of, restructuring, reprogramming alongside technology.
I think the question that's been pasted in the chat is sort of a subset of that topic. It's a question asking whether you've considered green solutions such as swamp coolers, or basically these kind of low tech and easily handmade or inexpensive technologies such as swamp coolers. Do you have any thoughts on that? I think if not, maybe I have perhaps one other question, which is not a dense question, Lydia. It's a simple question. Jeffrey said,
that was a compliment, just FYI.
I was worried.
Can't do that.
This is a very simple question, I think. Maybe not. But Jeffrey, you were saying at the beginning that the question of scale is essential to defining enclosure. And I think that the book really makes clear that this problem is one that we can think of from the scale of the body all the way to the scale of the territory, to the scale of the planet. The scale of the planet, I think, being one of the most compelling arguments that the book makes. But so I guess I'm just wondering, what are the ways in which your respective practices bridge the many scales in which enclosure occurs, and how have you all thought about that bridging of scales in your own work?
I feel like in my work and some of what I was going to contribute to the past questions have to do with making visible process, which I think happens at many different scales, and from the body breathing to the enclosure of your living space to the complex that you live in from each scale. And one thing I mentioned in my essay is the 1901 New Law Tenement Act, which effectively prioritized ventilation and prevented tenement dwellings. And it happened across three scales. One was the apartment layout, facilitating cross ventilation such that a window in the apartment is having access to the street and the central courtyard. And that affected the apartment layout, that affected the kind of form of the building, and then that also affected the urban morphology, the scale at the urban scale, how the building interacted with the rest of its city. And so at least like in terms of like how I design, those layers of design, certainly in that particular law, actually still impacts how I think about housing design. And I think process becomes really important in terms of making visible, challenging the default methods of production, especially like around material sourcing, and especially around kind of labor practices. I think Mae-ling just pointed to the fact that our enclosure has something, or used to have something to do with the materials that are right outside the building, and those materials being folded into the practice. So I think, there was a quote in the introduction with Jeffrey by Hannah Ardent about the process remaining invisible. And I think about that in my practice, about how we make visible, the hard to understand metrics related to air, the hard to understand metrics related to carbon and waste and water. A lot of those metrics exist at a global scale. So part of my practice is concerned with making visible these things to clients. As architects, I feel like a lot of us are visual learners. And so the visual component of it is a form of education and a kind of hopefully retraining of some of these conventions, such as sweating in a public space and not have it be relegated to maybe like the gym, right? That we become socially kind of aware of the process and create new grounds for having a conversation about these invisible metrics and invisible processes that go into designing a house or a housing project.
I'll answer that question briefly, because you mentioned, Elisa, an excellent point before that might be common to all of these papers, that there is no outside. I'm saying that in quotes. I don't even remember who said it, but it could be a facet that relates to everybody's work. And I think that one thing that I've been thinking of, and possibly I've been doing it through some projects in my practice, is how to create what if the outside is outside of the networks of economic development, power supply, the regular grid of urbanization. So for example, local power generation could be a form of outside, or a kind of practice that creates food outside of the regular distribution networks, supply chains, grid of energy supply. all of these networks that make that are forms of authority can be understood as an inside. And I think that if we can create systems or local context within which architecture can create these kinds of offset ecologies, that could be a form of resistance to enclosure.
I think a quick answer to that is, in my practice, I sort of sit between agriculture, food, and architecture. And, from where I'm from, there's been a long legacy of exporting low value agricultural commodities elsewhere, and then the importation of these building technologies, among many other things. And so for me, there's this enclosure of capital accumulation and development that I think needs to be broadened. I think specifically of how to activate the research enterprise that looks at local materials in new ways. And for me, I think to resist it is more of trying to link resources coming out of agriculture to architecture or to the food sector. And that sort of intersectoral cycling, particularly here, using waste, what is considered waste, is a huge area of opportunity. So in terms of material technology and political ambition, sort of broadening these enclosures of capital accumulation, transformation, and circulation is key in the work I do.
We only have a few minutes left, but there is one last question in the chat. I think, Daisy, in some ways your answer anticipated this question, but in case there are any other thoughts on it, I'll just ask. This is from Christian Nacarado. Hi, Christian, by the way. Mae-Ling's fantastic diagrams interpreting psychrometric charts seem like a great step in the direction of the problem Daisy identified, that architects don't yet have good conventions for representing climate, air, and human comfort. Do any of you have thoughts about, or have you seen other promising examples of how to represent these ideas? Maybe it's not through drawing.
I heard a wonderful talk by Charles Davis recently, and he actually addressed the topic of the technology of drawing. And perhaps the reason why I'm bringing this up is I think it's related to the question, which is perhaps the conventions of architectural drawing don't allow for our ability to represent the aspects that the contributors are referring to here. So I might posit that Mae-Ling and Daisy are trying to come after. In fact, some of Lydia's drawings in the last few years also are an attempt to, in a way, break down the traditional or standard ways of drawing in our practices. And I think we're going to see more and more of this sort of resistance to the traditional, and I'm referring to literally the traditional plan, section, elevation, the Beaux-Arts way of drawing the world really render the world only in one facet. And I think what we're seeing here with the contributors today and others in the book is that they're perhaps trying to draw the things that architects have historically for centuries never drawn before. That's not an answer, but it's just a comment.
Nora, I see you have your hand raised.
First, hold on, let me see if I can first, just to say thank you so much for all of the contributors and the presentations, and Jeffrey for this great talk, and Elisa for the great moderation. I guess I have a question that I will see if I can frame as a question, or if nothing else, maybe just to put some comments on the table or some thoughts, and I'll be quick. But it's making me think of an intersection that I was kind of asked by a colleague to think about, which is Buckminster Fuller's World Game, which I will mention really briefly in relationship to planetary habitability. One of the recent texts that I think have been really, let's say, impactful for me in the last year is Achille Mbembe's lecture turned into a text called Reflections on Planetary Habitability. And I'm thinking of habitability in relation to comfort, which I think we've already sort of brought up. And also, for instance, the kind of corners of the city rendered uninhabitable, Daisy, that you've shown. And of course, it comes up in many other contexts. But I think it's very interesting when you think about enclosure and visibility in relation to the calculable, which is what Achille Mbembe talks about. So there's the calculable, but there's also the visualizable or the visible in relation to drawing. So I'll try to kind of bring these things together in a series of brief comments. So on the one hand, life in uninhabitable spaces, this is what Achille Mbembe is arguing, is actually not considered life at all, at the edge of life or near death. And on the other, where life from within the disposable body is squeezed towards the uninhabitable. He talks about how old boundaries, what we considered boundaries between what is inside and what is outside of an organism, are now displaced. Life, in fact, moves between organisms. And the continuity between an organism and its environment are leading to an entirely different field of biology. And I wonder how we can think about that in architecture. They're also a different way of partitioning the planet. And the reason this is interesting in relation to Fuller's world game, because that's understanding, it's a kind of data capitalist model of understanding everything in the world. So the world game is meant to kind of map, visualize, and then distribute resources and energy from around the planet to kind of, this idea of resolving injustice and poverty and so on. But it assumes that all energy is calculable. And this is, I think, where Achille Mbembe, and I'm thinking about it in relation to what you were talking about, Mae-ling also, and the kind of maybe uncalculable agencies of certain material or energies. And so, yeah, I find all of these kind of attempts to draw what is uncalculable or not necessarily visualizable. And I think the question about maybe it's not necessarily drawing, I think is really interesting. But these are the things, these are the kinds of the sets of questions that it brought up to me. And I think it's really fascinating to put this conversation in relationship with Achille Mbembe's texts on planetary habitability. That's all.
Thank you, Nora. Are there any responses to that?
Well, that's a deep question. It really is. I mean, the first thing I was thinking was that, the better we get at trying to detect things that are invisible, the more we realize there's another threshold of microbes, of chemicals that exist beyond that. And I think about that in the development in the context of air filters. You're only as good as that detection object, and then there's so much more. And so it almost feels like an infinite exercise in trying to detect, calculate, quantify, and then control. And I think with COVID and the myriad of ways that we can have a virus enter our body, I think there's this sort of return to the trust in how you feel. You can't go testing every day. I've sort of been thinking about that a lot in terms of the panic that we've had with Omicron. And so there's a return to trusting your body and your immune system. And one of the most inspiring books that I've read recently, Ed Young's I Contain Multitudes, sort of painted this picture of our immune system as not something that is, just ready to fight whoever comes, but it is always engaging in a process of sending out messengers to essentially study invaders, develop a response to it, and then they're ready. So they're always in contact. They're always exposed and interacting with the outside world and whatever else is in it. And I think that reliance and that continuous exposure that we're not hiding, that we're not isolating, is something that I think about in response to what you just said, that it isn't quantifiable. There's a qualitative aspect of our own human body's detection, our own biology, that is incredibly important and that we need to believe in again.
Any other thoughts? I think we're basically at time. So if anyone has any concluding thoughts, we can just end it there as well.
I just want to say thank you, Elisa, and thank you, Lydia, Mae-ling, Daisy. It's great to connect with all of you. And in fact, I also want to point out there were a few other contributors in the audience as well. So I appreciate those listening in, and I look forward to following up with more of you in the future.
Yeah,
Thank you,
thank you. Thank all of you. It was such a wonderful event.
Thank you.
Thank you.